Let me grab my pen. And welcome to Learning Objective 2. This introduces you to financial ratios, which is really going to be a major part of Accounting 102, your next course in the sequence. Heavy emphasis on ratios, a lot of analysis there. Chapter 2 introduces you to some of them. We're not emphasizing it so much in Accounting 101. It's really about the bookkeeping, but it's a good introduction and it's good to know what's coming. Ratio analysis is pretty common. As a matter of fact, I've been seeing lots of doctors lately, and I know all of you have been to the doctor at some point in time in your life. And so, the doctor uses ratios to get a picture of your health, right? Could be your weight, height, it's your body mass ratio. When you have your blood pressure taken, that's a ratio. When you have blood work and they look at cholesterol and other types of things, those are a lot of ratios. So all of these particular ratios tell the doctor in some way, shape, or form what your overall health looks like in these general areas, right? If one of the ratios is really off, they might dive deeper in seeing why it's off, right? Well, that's how your doctor uses ratios. Accountants and financial analysts use ratios to look at the health of a company. And so this is basically what we're going to be, again, a heavy focus in Accounting 102, but this is basically what we are using ratio analysis for. And again, a ratio is simply a relationship between two numbers. And, by itself, one particular ratio might not mean much. But taken with a bunch of ratios, it kind of paints a picture of the overall financial health of the company. We're going to look at 3 areas that ratios are used. One is regarding profitability, which the owners, of course, want the company to be profitable. Companies need to grab cash to pay bills. So liquidity ratios look at their ability to get a hold of cash or turn things into cash so they can pay bills. And solvency ratios look at their ability to manage their debt over the long term. Okay, so they stay solvent. All right, so again, profitability ratios are looked at. Again, as you know, the way it goes, this is the income statement, revenue minus expenses gives you net income. Well, you understand that the net income is owned by the owners, right? If there's any profits, the profits are for the owners, right? They own those profits. Well, corporations are broken into many shares of ownership. So if the company had a very large profit and you are one of perhaps thousands or millions of shareholders, how much of that profit is yours? Well, we are going to be looking at something called earnings per share, which is the most popular profitability ratio. And it just basically tells the owners, if we took the profit of the company and we divided it up into all the shares of ownership, this would be your share of the profit. Okay. Liquidity ratios, like I say, really measure, can a company pay its coming debts? So this is oftentimes looking at current liabilities, how much current debt they have, and current assets, which are used to pay current liabilities, right? You need cash to pay your bills. And so liquidity ratios are often a comparison between the current assets of a company and the current liabilities of a company. And you'll learn about that very soon. And again, solvency ratios, the word solvent means you can stay afloat, you're surviving. Anyone who has heard the term insolvent means, in many cases, bankrupt or not existing anymore. So if insolvency means you're bankrupt or you don't exist anymore, solvency means you're still existing, you're still floating, because you're able to pay your debt over a long period of time. Sadly, there's been a lot of companies this past couple of years. Toys R Us, one of the bigger ones that's mostly everyone knows, who basically had too much debt to handle over the long term. And so they went out of business. Basically, they became insolvent. And so that's a ratio that helps analysts, managers, investors understand some portions of the financial health of a company. For the profitability ratios, we use the income statement, okay? Because the income statement is the only statement that tells us whether we made a profit or not. And so here, this is, it's curious that they put this in here, Best Buy. Ooh, okay, light bulb. You go, girl. Here they have Best Buy's income statements side by side for the accounting years ending 2013 and 2014, just side by side. The revenues are listed first here. All the expenses are listed and totaled here. And then the difference at the very bottom is the profit for 2014 and 2013 actually had a loss. So it's true that the owners benefit when the company is profitable because they own the profit. Well, when a company has a loss, it's really up to the owners to cover the loss if they want to continue staying in business. So they benefit when it's profitable, but they are responsible to cover losses so the business can continue to exist. So let's say you were one of, and we're going to focus on 2014's numbers here, okay? Let's say you saw this, you were one of the stockholders, and Best Buy has millions of stockholders, and you saw that the company had a 532, then these numbers are in millions, so $532 million $532 million profit. Well, how much of that profit? You only own one share, or you may only own 100 shares. And again, like I said, Best Buy has millions and millions of shares. So how do you know how much of that profit is yours, right? Your share. Well, that's what earnings per share. Remember the word earnings, it has multiple meanings, right? Earnings is the same as net income. Earnings is the same as profit, right? That's right. And so earnings per share, EPS, as it's listed here, okay, will tell you how much of the profit. So 2014, the company had a $532 million profit. Now the company has to average out the shareholders, the outstanding shares they have, because through the course of the year, companies either issue more shares of stock to raise money, or they actually buy back some of their shares. You've heard a lot of companies since the tax cuts a few years ago in the Trump administration, they bought back lots of shares of stock. Yeah, so that happens in some cases. In other cases, they issue more shares of stock to raise money. So here's the formula. Earnings per share equals the net income. Now it says minus preferred dividends. 93% of the time, the answer is going to be 0. And that's because preferred dividends are paid on preferred stock, something we haven't learned really about yet. But it's another class of stock that doesn't have any voting rights. Common stock has voting rights. It's full ownership with full voting rights. Common stock are owners, but they don't have any voting rights. Why would you want to be an owner and not have your voting right? Well, because you're given a dividend first. So if a company pays a dividend, preferred owners get their dividend first. Then the common shareholders get their dividend after. So literally, if there's any profit, preferred dividends would be paid first. But again, only 7% of companies in the US have preferred stock. 100% of companies have common stock, but only 7% of those have preferred stock, which means 93% of the time there's no preferred dividend. But technically it is part of the formula. So what we're really comparing is the net income, which is the profit, with the average of the shares that are here. Okay. And for 2014, which is this number here, when you take $532 million in profit and you divide it by, say, 342.5 million shareholders, each share would have earned $1.55 of the profit. And that's it. What we're looking for earnings per share is trends over time. Is the company more and more profitable over time? Is your share of ownership more profitable over time? Earnings per share tells you that. And it is one of the basic drivers of stock prices in something called fundamental analysis in finance. Fundamental analysis, the base of that is company stock prices are based on earnings. And so the higher the earnings of a company, the more profitable a company is, the higher the share price is. As we know, that's not how life works. It's a theory that works many, many times, but it's not foolproof. There are some stocks that have outrageously high prices that are not very profitable. There are either some stocks that don't have any earnings per share, but yet the prices of their stock are so high you would think they're highly profitable. So again, this is just one measure of how we look at profitability. It's the only measure that's introduced to you in this part of the chapter. And you'll get a couple of small examples of this. I'm not going to pepper you on this because you'll see all of this in Accounting 102. Okay, here is a review question for this. Remember, and I love the hearts here, thank you. We're looking at Stoneland Corporation. They have net income of $26,000. So this is their profit, okay? They have 6,000 shareholders on average, but they paid a preferred stock dividend of 2,000. So they obviously have preferred stock. One of the few companies that does. And so how do we figure this out? Well, it's the net income of the company minus the preferred dividends divided by the number of shareholders. And if you do that, it'll come out to $4 a share. So this 26,000 is the net income. This 2,000 is the subtraction out of preferred dividends. The rest is left for common stockholders, which is 24,000. There's 6,000 common stockholders. And so each of them would have a $4 earnings per share for this particular year, 2017. Please pay attention. So for the other side, the liquidity ratios and the solvency ratios, we use the balance sheet. Okay, we use the balance sheet. Liquidity ratios look at the current ability to pay its bills. And so we're really looking at comparing total current assets of this company with total current liabilities of this company. That's really what the liquidity ratios show, okay? Amazon is profitable. Actually, for the first several years of its existence, it was not profitable and the stock price was quite high. But Amazon is profitable today. They'll probably be more profitable as time goes on. I mean, I do see Amazon as a pretty well-run company, although, Walmart's coming at them. Walmart is taking on Amazon in a way that was not expected. And so it'll be interesting to see that battle, who ends up winning. But it's a battle of the titans. Sadly, we don't have a lot of competition in certain areas. But yeah, what I worry about is companies like Tesla. Tesla had an outrageously high stock price without really the profit to back it up. Tesla, it doesn't have a stable flow of profits. Doesn't have a stable flow of profits. It is profitable some quarters it's not, but it has a very high stock price in general. And so in that sense, that's just market enthusiasm. They think because Tesla's on the cutting edge of, electric batteries, electric cars, and other types of things, that the future looks good for Tesla, and so the stock price is much higher. Again, investors they don't play by the same rules. They don't play by the same rules. Okay. All right. So for liquidity, we're looking at current assets, and we're going to be focusing on 2014 numbers. Okay. So they have, and these are in millions as well. So they have this is $10,485 million of current assets. Here's their current liabilities, $7,436 million in current liabilities. So really we're comparing these two numbers for liquidity purposes. All right. So for liquidity purposes, again, liquidity ratios are about, does the company have access to cash to pay its bills? And bills are usually due quickly, so it's your current liabilities. Can they cover their current liabilities? That's really what this is about. Well, there's two ratios that, well, it's actually one ratio and one little mathematical formula they have that tell you about liquidity. The first thing the book introduces you to is something called working capital. And working capital is simply the difference between the two. So you take your current assets, subtract out your current liabilities. If there's anything left over, that's considered working capital. Right? That's considered over and above, cash available to the company over and above its current debt. Right. So for Best Buy, that had 10 billion in current assets and 7 billion in current liabilities, they actually have working capital of 3 billion. So they have access to a lot of extra money short term to help them do other things. But the big one that you'll hear about over and over again is current ratio. And the current ratio is literally a ratio. You're comparing the two numbers, the total of the current assets and the total of the current liabilities. Okay, that's really, this is a very popular ratio that's talked about. So let's look at Best Buy for 2014, because those numbers were provided. They had current assets of 10,485 million. When you compare that to, because it's just a comparison, 7,436 million of current liabilities, you get the current ratio of 1.41 to 1. Now the first number represents the assets, current assets. The second number represents the current liabilities. And how you would read this is that Best Buy has $1.41 of current assets to cover every dollar of current liabilities. Okay, so they have $1.41 of current assets to cover every dollar of current liabilities. That's how you would read the current ratio. Now, compared to its current ratio from the previous year, 2013, where they only had $1.11 of current assets to cover every dollar of current liabilities, that's improved. They have more current assets available to cover their current debt. So we would say that their liquidity has improved from 2013 to 2014 because they simply have more current assets to cover their current liabilities. The next little box here gives you a look at their competitor. I don't know if you've ever heard or seen an H.H. Gregg store, but they're mostly down south. I think I've been in one or near one in Maryland, or when I was living down there for a time, or maybe it was closer down to where my parents are in South Carolina. So H.H. Gregg is basically, looks like a Best Buy, except it has a different name on it. Right? You walk in, you look around, you'll see the same things you would in a Best Buy. So it's a competitor nationally with Best Buy. And their numbers for 2014 show its current ratio is 1.68 to 1. Remember, that first number represents current assets. The second number represents current liabilities. And so H.H. Gregg would have a current ratio that says that they have $1.68 of current assets for every dollar of current liabilities. So they are in a better position, liquidity-wise, than Best Buy for the year 2014. The industry is in rough shape. The industry, so an industry are all businesses that do the same type of business. So here, H.H. Gregg and Best Buy are they're electronics retailers. The industry, so has been under siege. It's really, it's tough. We lost Radio Shack, and Circuit City was several years back. It's a very, very difficult industry because it's highly competitive. And there's not a lot of profit margin because there's so much pressure on prices to go down. I mean, the newer phones and the newer TVs and the newer computers cost an arm and a leg, but literally within months, those prices start falling down as more and more stuff gets introduced and more companies start producing them. So it's a highly competitive industry. It's hard to make a profit. And so the industry's under siege. As again, I just mentioned two big companies, Radio Shack and Circuit City, that have succumbed to pressures of being in this particular industry that don't really exist anymore. They have a current ratio of 0.88 to 1. Now, what does that mean? Well, again, that first number is the current assets. The second number is the current liabilities. So the industry has 88 cents of current assets to cover every dollar in current liabilities. So in other words, the industry has a liquidity problem because their ratio can't even cover a buck for a buck. Okay, they can't even cover their bills. If everything was called today, they would have 88 cents for every dollar they owe, in current bills. So they would have to grab money by borrowing money to pay their bills. That's not true for H.H. Gregg. In a very good position. They're in the strongest position. And Best Buy has improved a lot in these 2 years that we are looking at. So that's what a current ratio is, and that's how to read it. Okay, the last ratios, and actually there's only one, solvency. Solvency basically is, can the company afford its long-term debt, which of course you're going to pay interest over a long period of time. Long-term debt is not free. Long-term debt comes with interest payments. And of course, the more and more debt you have, the more and more interest you're paying, plus you got to pay the loan back. So the solvency ratio really is looking at the company's ability to handle its long-term debt or its total debt over the long term, okay? The only ratio we're going to be learning about here, something called the debt to asset ratio, is exactly what it sounds like. The total debt of the company, which is its total liabilities, compared to the total assets of the company, which is its total assets, will give you the debt to asset ratio. Total liabilities, you'll find on the balance sheet. Total assets, you'll find on the balance sheet. And that's really all we're comparing here in this ratio. The total amount of liabilities a company has in relationship to the total amount of assets they have. That's it. Because remember, when you go and buy an asset even for yourself, whether it's a house or a car, oftentimes you're borrowing money to buy that asset. So how much money you have to borrow to buy the asset? All right. Well, this ratio looked at the percentages of liabilities that have been used to buy assets for the company. So for Best Buy, the 2014 numbers show that Best Buy has over 10 billion in total liabilities and 14 billion for total assets, which means that 72% of those assets were purchased or financed by debt. 72% seems relatively high. We'll find out. Well, in 2013, their debt to asset ratio was 78%. So 78% of their assets were bought with liabilities or debt. So obviously it's come down, which is a good thing. So we would say their solvency ratio has improved because they have reduced the amount of total debt that the company has to manage over the long term. But its competitor, H.H. Gregg, in 2014, had a 51% debt to asset ratio, which means that they only 51% of their assets are financed with debt. Well, there's only two ways to finance your assets, with liabilities or equity. It's the only way you finance your assets. You either finance them with debt or you finance them with owner's equity, stockholders' equity. Of course, you can do both, which is very common. In this case, H.H. Gregg does not rely very heavily on debt. You know, for every dollar of assets they own, they only needed to borrow 51% of that dollar to buy it. Okay, so they are very well positioned here. And again, I was mentioning how difficult this industry is. You know, the industry average here for a debt to asset ratio of 88% means that 88% of the assets are financed with debt, right? They have 88 cents of total liabilities for every dollar of assets that they have. That is an extremely high percentage for a retail store. I'm not saying 88% is ridiculous for, say, a manufacturer, you know, because they often have assets. They rely heavily on equipment, factories, other types of things if you're a manufacturer. And if you're putting up a factory, you're going to have a mortgage. If you have equipment, you're going to have loans on that equipment because that's how you're buying, you know, millions and millions of dollars of equipment. You're borrowing money to do that. So a high debt to asset ratio for a manufacturer doesn't bother me, but it does bother me for a retail store because they're not manufacturing anything, right? They're just selling stuff in the store. And here you have the industry is heavily indebted. Okay, and that's why you saw Circuit City collapse about, I would expect it's 10 years ago now or more. And you also saw Radio Shack within the last few years close as well. They just simply have too much debt. There's no profit margin to pay the debt off and be profitable. Best Buy is improving, which is good. Right. H.H. Gregg is in very, very good shape, comparatively speaking. And so again, you know, debt is good when it's used wisely. Again, here's General Motors, which is a large manufacturer, right? They make cars and trucks and SUVs, among other things. So how are those cars, trucks, and SUVs being made? They're being made in factories that are heavily relied on robotics and machinery. Well, robotics and machinery cost a lot of money, as do factories, and they're borrowing money to buy those things or to have those things. That's common. That would be normal. And so having a higher debt to asset ratio for a manufacturer like General Motors, like I said, doesn't bother me. But clearly here, General Motors is 74%. You just saw, and I don't know what year this is from, but you just saw Best Buy with a very similar percentage of debt to assets. So what does Best Buy do? They're a retailer. They're a retailer. They don't make anything. They don't need heavy equipment or big factories to borrow money for. So they're heavily reliant on debt, which makes it tricky. Makes it very, very tricky. Okay, we are not studying the cash flow statement until next semester, so we don't have to worry about the free cash flow part of this, but that is another ratio that's being used that you don't have to worry about. All right, so a very quick, and this is already done in your book for you. This is on what page is it? Page 57 and 58. So if you have your book with you, page 57 and page 58. If you don't have a book, it's under the reading material for chapter 2, learning objective 2 reading. And you just scroll all the way down to the bottom of that, and the do it exercise is there. Again, the wonderful thing about the do it exercise is the solution is provided. So you can see step by step how things are done. And you should use that when you're doing your homework. So again, profitability ratios, we take the earnings per share that we learned about. We take the net income, we subtract out preferred dividends, and we divide that by the average number of shares. So those are the numbers. There's a long list of numbers here, but those are the numbers we would need to calculate our profitability ratio, called the earnings per share ratio. Right? For the liquidity ratios, we need two numbers, because it's comparing total current assets and total current liabilities. Those are the only two numbers we need for the liquidity ratios, those two numbers. And the solvency ratio, which is total debt to total assets, we only need total liabilities and total assets. Those two numbers are the only two numbers we need to calculate the debt to asset ratio that we just looked at. So you're going to have a little bit of homework that practices this. I don't get too frustrated about it. It should be relatively straightforward, but you're going to see a lot of that in Accounting 102. There's a lot of analysis that we do in every chapter after the bookkeeping cycle is done. Okay. So I'll bring it back to our main screen and ask for any questions.